In the next lecture dealing with the presidency, we're going to look at the presidential power. And the president does have an enormous amount of power, but there's different types of power that the president has. And so if we look at presidential power, Article 2 of the Constitution states that the executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States. And then sections 2 to 3 deal with the powers and the duties of the United States president. And there are a number of different types of power that the president will wield. And one of those is called express powers. And express powers are specifically defined powers granted to the president in the Constitution. They are literally spelled out. Sometimes called enumerated powers. They're numbered. Here they are. These are what the powers that the president has. And so some people think that those are really the only powers that the president has, but they're not. He also has delegated powers. And delegated powers are constitutional powers that are assigned to one governmental agency, but that are exercised by another agency with the express permission of the first. And so the Congress has an extraordinarily large amount of things that it is supposed to do. Over time, it has delegated a lot of those powers to the executive branch, to the president, to some of the agencies within the executive branch, and so there is some significant power that has been delegated to the president by the Congress. And then there are some things called inherent powers. And inherent powers are not specified in the Constitution or the law, but they're, quote, powers over and beyond those expressly granted in the Constitution or reasonably to be implied from express grants. So what this means is that the president might have an expressed power that he is supposed to carry out, but it cannot be carried out unless he exercises some of these other powers. And even though these other powers aren't listed or enumerated in the Constitution, he inherently has those because without them, he could not carry out the duties of his office, of these express powers outlined in the Constitution. So we're going to look at each one of these a little bit more in depth. So the expressed powers are going to be the powers that are the greatest powers of the presidency. And there are several different categories of expressed powers. Okay. First category of expressed power is military power. And this is probably some of the most important power exercised by the American president. The Constitution gives the president the power to be the commander-in-chief, which is defined as the commander of the national military and state National Guard units. The president is the highest military authority in the United States. He directs the Secretary of Defense, who is the individual that heads up the Defense Department or the department over our military. He directs the National Intelligence Network, like the CIA, the National Security Council, the National Security Agency, the FBI. And interestingly, oftentimes the president is a civilian and doesn't really have any any military power or any military experience of his own. And so because of this, he is going to rely on what are called the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And the Joint Chiefs of Staff are a council of 7 individuals that advises the president, advises the Secretary of Defense, advises the Homeland Security Council, advises the National Security Council, and it is going to be the council is going to consist of a chairman of the Joint Chiefs, a vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and then a military service chief from each of the branches of the military. A military service chief from the Army, the Marine Corps, the Navy, the Air Force, and then the chief of the National Guard Bureau. These are all appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate, and so the president does have military power. Now, to be clear, the president does not have the power to declare war. That is a power that is reserved for the legislature. So the legislature is the group that must declare war. But the president has a lot of leeway to disperse troops and mobilize troops and use them all throughout the world. It is sort of a tug-of-war of power that has been going back and forth between the legislature and the presidency for a significant period of time. So one category of power is military power. Another category is judicial power. The president has the ability to grant reprieves, pardons, and amnesty, meaning he can reprieve somebody from a crime they've been committed, pardon them, commute their lives, compute their sentence of execution to life, give certain individuals amnesty, and it can be used on behalf of a particular individual. Most presidents utilize their pardon power in the 11th hour of their presidency, meaning right before they leave office. Gerald R. Ford is going to be an individual that is most noted for utilizing his judicial power when he granted his predecessor, Richard M. Nixon, a pardon. And he granted this pardon to Nixon, quote, for all offenses against the United States which he has committed or may have committed. So Gerald Ford was President Nixon's vice president, and when Nixon saw the writing on the wall and realized that he was about to be impeached, he resigned from office with the understanding that he would receive a full pardon from the vice president when he took over in the office of the presidency. And so Gerald Ford does step in as the new president of the United States and grants this full pardon to Richard Nixon. And some say it was a good thing because it sort of helped put an end to the Watergate scandal and allowed the nation to sort of heal. Others say that Nixon, it was sort of a corrupt thing because Nixon didn't stand trial for his crimes. Whatever the case, it is a very significant example of the use of judicial powers of the presidency. Andrew Johnson gave full amnesty to all Southerners who had participated in the Civil War, or what they called the Late Rebellion. Jimmy Carter similarly gave amnesty to all draft dodgers of the Vietnam War. Bill Clinton pardoned around 140 individuals in his last hours in office. George W. Bush pardoned Scooter Libby, who was Vice President Dick Cheney's chief of staff when Libby was convicted in the Valerie Plame CIA issue. But interestingly enough, George W. Bush pardoned fewer individuals than most presidents, and Donald Trump has already exercised pardon power when he pardoned Joe Arpaio, the Arizona sheriff who was charged with criminal contempt of court charges. So they do have this judicial power to sort of overrule some of the judicial actions that have taken place against certain individuals. They also have diplomatic powers. The president is America's head of state. Head of state means that he's the chief representative in dealing with other nations. He is sort of our mascot. He is the face of our nation. He has the power to make treaties for the United States, but these treaties have to be approved by the Senate. They must be ratified by the Senate in order for them to actually have the force of law. Because of the need of Senate approval, the president sometimes utilizes what is known as executive agreements in place of a treaty. These act just like a treaty because it is a contract between two nations, but it does not require the approval of the Senate. And an excellent example of an executive agreement operating as a treaty is the Iranian nuclear deal under President Obama. And so, they do have this power to engage with other nations on behalf of the United States. And the president has the power to recognize other countries' legitimacy, which is important because if we recognize their legitimacy, it means that we can trade with them. We recognize them as a specific country, free, or maybe not free, but as an independent country all on their own. The president also has executive power. Article 2, Section 3 stipulates that the president must see that all laws are faithfully executed. Section 2 provides that the president will appoint all executive officers and federal judges. So essentially, the president is the CEO of the country. He appoints executive officers. He appoints federal judges. He operates in any manner necessary to execute the laws fully and faithfully. He also has some legislative powers. So even though it is the executive branch, he does have some legislative power. And there are two constitutional provisions that are primary in the president's legislative arena. Article 2, Section 3 of the Constitution says, quote, presidents shall from time to time give Congress information on the state of the Union and recommend to their consideration such measures as he shall judge necessary and expedient. And so we sort of know this as the State of the Union address. And if you've ever watched a State of the Union address, it's usually held in January or February, and the president comes together in front of a joint session of Congress, and the cabinet is there, and the Supreme Court judges are there. Everybody is there, and he lays out essentially his plan of government over the next year, what he would like to see accomplished. And so he recommends some legislative action by the Congress in his State of the Union address. Now, since FDR, presidents have utilized the State of the Union as a way to initiate these legislative proposals. And, you know, as time has progressed and we've come to more modern presidencies, they have utilized it more as their bully pulpit to sort of put out there what it is they hope to get accomplished. Now, interestingly enough, there was a debate as to whether or not the State of the Union is a constitutional duty. It is. We were in a fight between Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi and Donald Trump, President Donald Trump, in the last State of the Union address, because the government was shut down and Pelosi refused to invite the president to deliver that State of the Union address in the House chamber. And so if she refuses to invite him to do so, he cannot deliver it in the House chamber. And so there was a fight going back and forth. Yes, it is a constitutional requirement that there be a State of the Union. No, it does not have to be done via television. And it can be simply a letter that the president writes to Congress. And this has been done. There is precedent for this in American history prior to television, prior to radio, prior to those types of things. The address does not have to be delivered in person. It can be done via a letter. So as long as there is a State of the Union, it doesn't matter if it's broadcast. It doesn't matter if it's a letter, etc. And then the second of the constitutional provisions that are in the legislative arena is the power of the veto, which is outlined in Article 2, Section 7. Which gives the president veto power, which prevents a bill from becoming a law. And I'm sorry, I believe that might be in Article 1, Section 7. The Constitution implies that the president has the power of legislative initiative. And legislative initiative is the president's implied power to bring a legislative agenda to Congress. And so he does bring a legislative agenda to Congress in hopes that the Congress will take that up. And the legislative ability is extended by the use of what are called executive orders, which is a rule or regulation issued by the president that has the effect and formal status of law. So if it's something that needs to be put into effect very quickly, the president can issue an executive order to do this. If it is something that won't pass Congress and he wants it done anyway, he can sign an executive order to do so. It has the status of law. Sometimes the new president who comes in will overturn former executive orders. There are some very famous executive orders that have occurred in American history. FDR signed an executive order that created the concentration camps in America of Japanese individuals of Japanese descent after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. There is Harry Truman utilized an executive order to desegregate the United States Armed Forces. So these have been utilized, and they are not without their controversy, but it is a legislative ability of the president that does have the formal status of law when it is signed. And so now if we turn our attention to these delegated powers, these are laws and statutes passed by Congress. The president has the authority as it is granted by Congress. And so Congress doesn't have the ability to exercise all of its powers, and so it delegates some of that to the executive branch. And it's usually not directly to the president, but it is to executive agencies which the president oversees. And so the president does sort of indirectly affect or has the ability to affect some of the policies that are carried out. Implementation of new agencies to carry out objectives like the Department of Homeland Security is going to be an example of one of these delegated powers. The creation of the Department of Homeland Security after 9/11 will be a power delegated to the president by the legislative branch. Inherent powers, and we've talked a little bit about this before, but these are not specified in the Constitution or the law, but they are, quote, powers over and above these expressly granted in the Constitution or reasonably to be implied from express grants. So, it's not specified by the Constitution, but it is necessary in order to carry out some of the other duties and responsibilities that the president has. And so it's kind of like the necessary and proper clause in the executive branch. It allows the president to do whatever is necessary to carry out the enforcement of the laws. These are usually only, I say only, but they are usually asserted by presidents in times of war and crisis, and done in such a way that you can justify them because we are at war and there is a crisis facing the nation. And so we're going to look at some examples of this, and the first one that we look at is Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln issued a series of executive orders which had no legal basis of doing. Without Congress in session, Lincoln did a number of things. He combined the state militia into a 90-day national volunteer force. He called for 40,000 new volunteers. He enlarged the regular army and the Navy. He diverted $2 million in unspent appropriations to take care of some military needs. He instituted censorship of the U.S. mail. He ordered a blockade of southern ports. And most importantly, he suspended the writ of habeas corpus in border states and ordered the arrest by military police of individuals whom he deemed to be guilty of treasonous action, in direct violation with the Constitution. If you don't know, a writ of habeas corpus is the ability of a person to report an unlawful detention or imprisonment to a court and request a court hearing to determine if an imprisonment is lawful. So if you are arrested, they can't just arrest you and throw you in jail and keep you there and not charge you with anything. You have the ability to seek redress in a court if you feel like you have been arrested unlawfully, and there are no charges. Lincoln suspended this. He said that it was necessary to protect the United States by arresting these individuals by military police if he deemed them guilty of treasonous actions. Now, Congress wasn't in session, but when Congress reconvened, Lincoln reported these actions and asked Congress to pass laws enabling him to do these, and they did. And so this is sort of an example of asking for forgiveness instead of permission. Another example is Harry Truman. The United States invaded, excuse me, let me back up. There was an invasion of South Korea by North Korea in 1950. Congress prepared to declare war, but Truman told them that it was the president's decision where and when to deploy the American military. Truman dispatched American forces to Korea without a presidential declaration. And because it was a national security emergency, Congress felt obliged to approve money to finance the conflict. And so Truman sort of tells Congress, look, it's my responsibility to determine when we should go into some place, not yours. And so I'm going to go ahead and do this, and you're just going to have to fund it even though we didn't have an official declaration of war. And so he's saying, I'm protecting the United States by doing this, and you can either get on board or you can get off at the next station. This is going to become the norm for military conflict. There will not be an official declaration of war for Vietnam, for Bosnia, for Afghanistan, for Iraq. Presidents are going to start utilizing this precedent set by Harry Truman, utilizing inherent powers in regards to the military. All of these are going to be fought without a formal declaration of war. Richard Nixon, he's going to utilize Truman's approach in Vietnam, Congress responds to Nixon by passing what is known as the War Powers Act that states that the president can send troops into action abroad only by authorization of Congress, or if American troops are already under attack or serious threat. This was passed over Richard Nixon's veto. So the Congress is actually going to override Richard Nixon's veto because it takes away Richard Nixon's power, the president's power, to deploy troops into areas without the authorization of Congress. It required the president to inform Congress of any planned military campaign. Richard Nixon had been doing things in secret with his national security advisor, with his Secretary of Defense and Secretary of State. They had been bombing Cambodia secretly, and so it required the president to inform Congress of any planned military campaign and stipulated that forces must be withdrawn within 60 days unless Congress acts to extend military action. So it's really going to limit the ability and the amount of time that the president can deploy troops to certain areas around the world. Presidents have often ignored this act, claiming the inherent responsibility to defend the nation, but it is on the books. And then George W. Bush, post 9/11. Congress passed resolutions to approve the invasions of Afghanistan in 2001 and Iraq in 2003. President Bush, however, asserted that he didn't require the congressional actions to do so as he was defending the nation. So, you know, they gave their blessing to do this, but Bush says, that's great, I'm glad you gave your blessing, I don't need it because I'm defending the nation. I'm carrying out my powers, and this is just one of the inherent powers necessary to carry out one of my express powers. At his disposal, the president has a lot of resources, and one of these resources is known as the presidential cabinet. This is the traditional but informal designation for the heads of all the major government departments. These are going to be individuals appointed by the president and approved by a Senate vote. The cabinet meets but makes no real government decisions as a group. And so if you were to compare this to the British cabinet, it's going to be significantly different because in Great Britain, the cabinet sets all national policy as a team. The cabinet in the United States does not. Usually, these individuals oversee a department that they're the head of. They are in, and they oversee these policies in line with the president's policies and the president's wishes. And so you'll have the cabinet. There's like 14 or 15 cabinet secretaries: Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, Secretary of Homeland Security, Secretary of Agriculture, Housing and Urban Development, all these different people. They carry out a duty because they run the executive agency that is underneath the president. But they are supposed to do it in accordance with the president's policies and the president's wishes. So it's really the president that and his staff that are setting policy. It's not going to be the cabinet making the policy. The White House staff, these are analysts, these are advisors. They're individuals that are closest to and most responsive to the president's needs and preferences. They give very broad advice, typically political in nature. They're sometimes referred to as, quote, the kitchen cabinet because they're informal but influential in helping the president to make decisions. They're usually given titles like special assistant or presidential aide. They do not require Senate approval, but names, positions, and salaries of these individuals are listed on the White House website. So these are going to be the people that are in the inner circle of the president. They're sort of in his ear. People like, if you follow politics, President Bush has some White House staffers that he is very close to, like Kellyanne Conway and his daughter Ivanka and his son-in-law Jared Kushner. These are going to be White House staff members. But there are also there's the executive office of the president. The executive office of the president is composed of between 1,500 and 2,000 highly specialized people who work for executive office of the president agencies. And the most important of these agencies is going to be the OMB, or the Office of Management and Budget. It is the OMB that is going to prepare the national budget. They're going to design the president's programs. They're going to report on agency activities, and they're going to oversee regulatory proposals. So it's going to be these individuals that really are specialized in a certain area that carry out very specific policy proposals, whereas individuals in the White House staff are very general and tell the president to do things because it looks good politically. There's also another agency called the Council of Economic Advisors, or the CEA. They constantly analyze the economy and economic trends, and they attempt to give the president the ability to anticipate events rather than waiting and reacting. So they try to be a proactive group instead of a reactive group in regards to economics. There's also the Council on Environmental Quality. They do the same as the economic advisors, but for environmental issues. And then you have the National Security Council, which is a big deal. These are military, diplomatic, and intelligence officials. They meet regularly to advise the presidents on national security matters. And there are plenty more individuals in this executive office of the president. As I said, there are between 1,500 and 2,000 people. The vice president is a significant resource for the president as well. He technically has two constitutional duties. Number one, wait for the president to die. And number two, preside over the Senate and cast a tie-breaking vote. And when the Senate is split evenly or very close to even, it can become important to have a vice president cast a tie-breaking vote. Following the 2016 election of President Donald Trump, Vice President, I just drew a blank, Mike Pence, excuse me, he had to come to the Senate floor to cast tie-breaking votes. One for the confirmation of the Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos. It was a 50-50 split in the Senate. Even though the Republicans had a majority, two Republicans defected and voted with the Democrats because Betsy DeVos is not an individual who should be in the office of Secretary of Education. And so there was a 50-50 split, and he had to break that vote. The office of the presidency, vice presidency, was historically used to neutralize individual. In fact, that is why Teddy Roosevelt became the vice president of William McKinley, because they didn't have anything to do. It neutralized them. They put them in that position to sort of shut them up and keep them out of other offices that they can cause more chaos with. Well, it backfired for the individuals that put Teddy Roosevelt as William McKinley's vice president, because McKinley will be assassinated and Teddy Roosevelt will take over as president, become a very popular president in his own right. And typically, the presidency is not a fun job, and it is described as not worth, quote, a bucket of warm piss or spit, depending on the resource that you were using. But Cactus Jack John Nance Garner, who was a Texas vice president for FDR, is going to describe the vice presidency as that. But because the vice president doesn't really have a whole lot to actually do constitutionally, the president will choose someone that is advantageous to their electoral process, to kind of cobble together this coalition of states to get themselves elected. One thing that comes to mind is the Boston to Austin connection between JFK and LBJ. They hated each other. They weren't friends, but LBJ was able to deliver the South to, or at least Texas, to Kennedy. And so it was advantageous for Kennedy to put him on the ticket. The job has become more involved in the past 25 years, with the president utilizing their vice presidents in certain roles. And so now the vice president actually has a much more significant role in the presidency than they used to. The vice president will be utilized to head up task force, to represent the president when the president can't go overseas or can't go to a certain funeral or whatever. They typically are that individual that steps into that role. And another resource that is sometimes overlooked is the First Lady, the wife of the president. One of the most notable wives of presidents in the last 70 years is going to be Eleanor Roosevelt, and she was instrumental in shaping policies in FDR's administration. Hillary Clinton also comes to mind. She was instrumental in the campaign and policy formation of Bill Clinton's presidency. She will then go on to be elected to the Senate in 2000. She ran for president in 2008 and in 2016, and then will become the President Obama's Secretary of State in her own right. And so the president has a lot of resources at his disposal. All right, so we're going to sort of stop here with the presidency. If you have any more questions on the presidency, feel free to reach out to me. Go ahead and make sure that you are reading in your textbook. Go ahead and read the next chapter, which deals with the bureaucracy, because it's sort of an outgrowth of the presidency, the executive office, and they sort of go hand in hand with one another. I'm not going to be lecturing over that just for time's sake. We've already crammed so much into this one unit. But if you have any questions, please let me know, and I will see you in the next lecture.